the word disruption to me really means challenging the status quo, looking for ways to do things better. It doesn't mean, hey, I want to walk into a room and tick people off, right? But I also am going to stand firm and not get pushed around. And that's really, I think, what my clients are looking for.
Are you ready? Are you sitting down? It's season 4 of the Shine On podcast. Absolutely terrific guests. My take on what's happening in the world of divorce. Are the stakes high? You better believe it. The unfiltered and real take on what divorce is like from the absolute best professionals. Life, love, marriage, divorce, relationships, finances. Topics that far too often many people shy away from. But not here on the Shine On podcast. It's episode 78 of the Shine On podcast. I'm Evan Shine. We have an absolutely terrific episode today and a wonderful guest on the Shine On podcast, featured guest segment coming up. I am joined by divorce financial strategist, Rhonda Noordyk. Rhonda is known internationally for her work in helping women navigate the financial aspects of the divorce process. And producer Dave, this conversation with Rhonda was awesome. And we get into, look, divorce is a time of transition. Divorce is scary. It's uncertain. It's full of the unknown. And to have someone by your side who gets it, who can be there for you while you go through the process, it's an enormous plus and such a great resource.
Absolutely. I enjoyed the talk. It made me reflect upon what I've come through in my personal divorce. And Rhonda's she's a natural. A compelling speaker. Great episode.
And Dave, you know who else is a natural? You are, my friend. So speaking of you, Dave, let's fire up the docket. A July 4th weekend on the horizon. I got to ask you, Dave, any big July 4th plans?
No, I'll probably find a kiddie pool and a 30-pack of Busch, and that's what I normally do. No, I don't.
Dave, you can do that. When you're first saying that, part of me thinks I should have a problem with you swimming in the kiddie pool. But the fact that you're drinking Busch beer, that bothers me more. I mean, Dave, you could do better than Busch beer. I mean, you're not playing beer pong in college, drinking Busch beer.
You're right. I should drink American. Okay, Miller Lite. No,
you're better than that too. I mean, you strike me as a craft beer guy. I know you're a big bourbon guy, but you got to do better on the beer front. I'm concerned for you.
Craft beer always tastes good, but unfortunately, the method I have of selecting which craft beer I want is what has the weirdest name, because they all have strange names. But okay, for you, Evan, we'll fire up the grill. We'll fire up some craft beer. But may, sir, I fire up the docket.
Let's do it.
All right.
And now, let's see what's on the docket.
Two very interesting items on the docket today. First one comes to us from MSN.com.
Item 1.
Headline reads, I'm paid £300 an hour as a divorce lawyer, but I'm not their friend. Obviously, it comes to us from someone across the pond. Lawyer, the author is Isolde Walters. But interesting aspect of divorce law is when you're a divorce lawyer like yourself, are you a friend or are you just an advocate? What are you? And what was your reaction, Evan, to this piece?
Well, Dave, when I read this, I was reflecting on my own career, on my own path, what they tell you in law school, what they don't tell you in law school, as a young family law attorney, what you think the job's going to entail, and then what the actual reality is, right? And I think, look, very often in the practice of family law, you play the role of lawyer, but you also play the role of therapist, you play the role of advocate, you play the role of confidant. I think you need to show emotional intelligence, demonstrate empathy, right? A lot of attorneys, they're smart, right? They can be strategic. But I also think you need to understand and appreciate what your clients are going through and treat your clients who are going through the divorce process. If your own family member, if your brother was going through a divorce, how would you want him treated by an attorney, right? And sure, I spend a lot of time on the phone with my clients. My clients confide in me. My clients talk to me about the most intimate details of their life. That's the job. That's the job you signed up for. And I love every minute of what I do. I always say I wouldn't practice another area of law if I wasn't practicing family law, divorce law, matrimonial law. I truly love it. My clients know that. So do you find yourself being a friend to your clients? No, I don't think you find yourself being a friend to your clients, but I think you need to spend time with your clients, advocate for them, strategize with them, demonstrate empathy, demonstrate an understanding, helping them get to a place that they want to be.
Yeah, and some of this is kind of semantics because, as you say, you're not their friend. You're not. You're being hired to do a job, and you're going to do it the best you can. But in learning a lot of intimate details about someone, the client might feel like you're their friend, and I think to some degree that's okay. I have a lawyer who is a friend, and he has represented me in a couple of basically minor business disputes I've had, but they were important to me. And I felt comforted knowing that he was on my side. He knew what was going on in my life. It might not work out for everyone. Some say don't go into business with your friends. But for some, most importantly, do you trust the person? And I'd say if it feels like friendship, that's okay.
Well, Dave, let me ask you this from the client perspective, right? You mentioned your own situations. You were the client on certain situations. Was there ever a time in that professional relationship where you were having conversations that approached the friend zone more than the business relationship zone that could have been uncomfortable?
Maybe so, but at the end of the day, I trusted the person with details of my life. So once you do that, to me, it's a matter of semantics, whether I want to call the lawyer my friend or not. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go out for beers after the case is over. Probably not. But you want someone who you trust with some of the most important moments of your life. There are friends that I have that I wouldn't trust with the most important moments of my life. So in a way, it's strangely even more close than a relationship than with a friend. But I think it comes down to if you trust the person, then it's okay. And if, on the other hand, a good lawyer won't pry into matters of your life that they don't need to. And lawyers are very careful about that. And you also have the attorney-client privilege, which should give you some comfort knowing that you can tell your lawyer almost anything you want, and it will be kept between the two of you.
And Dave, you went through the divorce process, as you've talked about, you've been open about. In the divorce space, do you think it's harder to keep those from the client, right? Obviously, you're sharing a lot of intimate details about your life, about your marriage, about your relationship, about issues and problems that happen. Do you think it's a challenge for the client who wants to talk to their attorney about everything?
Yeah, it's challenging because you'll have delicate moments where, and I'm sure you've represented friends, Evan. I'm sure many friends have trusted you. And then I'm sure other friends have said, no offense, but I want to keep you as my friend and not my lawyer. And all of that's fine. It can get sticky in some situations where if I am married and have a friend that is a lawyer and then I'm getting divorced, that lawyer may still want to be friends with my ex, who knows? And then the lawyer all of a sudden is going to learn things that he didn't know about what was going on behind closed doors. And that the lawyer then has the responsibility of keeping that quiet. And you might say, well, geez, how's the lawyer going to keep it quiet? He's going to bump into the ex. They're going to chat it up. Every lawyer I know takes the attorney-client privilege very seriously. And so if once you hire somebody as a lawyer, your relationship will change. You can still be friends, but it's different. Have you had that experience?
I have. And I think it falls into the two buckets that you mentioned, right? Clients who are friends have trusted me to represent them. And then there's people who say, look, you know what? Give me your thoughts, give me your advice, but I'm not going to have you in particular represent me. I might bounce things off you. And in both situations, you provide your guidance, you have discussions, have conversations, and I can appreciate both sides and both perspectives.
We move on to item 2.
Item 2.
This comes to us from Fortune.com. And the headline reads, Women initiate most great divorces despite the financial risk. Here's what made one 69-year-old realize, I'm going to do it. We've talked about gray divorces in the past, those divorces that happen in the twilight of one's life, What are your thoughts on this one, Evan?
Well, David, this doesn't surprise me. And correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's been statistics, studies that both of us have come across that women file for divorce more than men in general. So when I read that women are filing for divorce over the age of 50 and the gray divorce, it doesn't surprise me. Look, we've talked about the gray divorce, like you mentioned. I get it. People are living longer. They want different things. They want different things in a relationship. And they view this next chapter as exciting, a chapter full of potential. And it doesn't surprise me. And I'm sure there's a lot of psychological reasons that go into this. But to me, I say if there's another chapter and you find yourself in a relationship or marriage that isn't working for any reason, right? You obviously want to live the best possible life that you can live. What's your take?
Although I have plenty of gray hair, well, I don't have plenty of gray hair. I have little hair, and what hair I do, it is gray. However,
it is gray.
It is gray.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Okay, you don't have to go shouting at Evan, but we,
I mean, it's a nice gray. It's a shiny gray. It's not like a dull gray.
Distinguished. Thank you. I'll take that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take that. However, I'm not quite of the age that I don't think would qualify as a gray divorce. I'm not married to anyone to divorce now, anyways. But the reason I bring it up is because as we all age, we think about our mortality. We think about the time how we're going to spend the time remaining on Earth. My parents have been married since they were early 20s. They've married, I don't even know how long. It's been a long time. and they're still together. They're in their 80s. God bless them. But just because you're up there in age, I've come across couples who are approaching the golden years, and some of them seem to be miserable and seem to be staying in the marriage just because, oh, well, now what's the point? Well, there is a point. There is a point. I mean, being 70, being 80 isn't the head straight to the nursing home kind of deal that it used to be with things we've learned about health and medicine and all that. Enjoy your final years, right? And if that means saying goodbye to your partner, then so be it. It makes sense. And I think it's defeatist to think that it's not worth it. But I don't know if you share those thoughts, Evan.
No, I do. Look, I have to call you distinguished. How can I argue with anything you say?
Okay. Now, listeners, let's hear from you in another installment of Ask Evan.
Ask Evan.
Ask Evan.
Ask Evan.
Today we hear from Leslie in Poughkeepsie, New York. Leslie writes the following. I am contemplating a divorce, but the only reason I have is that I'm unhappy. Am I going to be able to have legal grounds to file for divorce? What advice do you have for Leslie, Evan?
Leslie, that's a great question. And the short answer is yes. You do have legal grounds to get divorced. New York is a no-fault state. You can file for divorce on the grounds of irretrievable breakdown in the marriage. So if you want to get divorced, you can get divorced. Now, obviously, the bigger question is, what's the way you're going to go about the divorce process? Are you going to use litigation, negotiation, collaborative law, mediation? And you can figure all of that out once you have a conversation, a consultation with an attorney. But don't let the idea of feeling that you're stuck in the marriage or stuck in the relationship deter you in any way. If you want to get divorced, you can get divorced for the reason that you're simply unhappy.
And that might be a myth among some, that divorce is a win-lose kind of thing, and you need a reason to win. In other words, I deserve to get divorced from you because you did this. You were unfaithful. You stole money from me, whatever it may be. And some sticky issues may come out eventually in the divorce case, but if I hear you correctly, Evan, no fault means exactly what it sounds like.
That's correct. And look, all these issues, like you said, may come up, but if someone wants to get divorced for any reason, they don't need to feel stuck, feel trapped, stay in a relationship for any reason, right? You have the no-fault statutes. You can proceed with a divorce and get divorced.
That's another edition of Ask Evan. If you want to submit a question for Evan to answer on the podcast, email producer Dave at david@pod617.com.
Our featured guest on this week's episode of the Shine On podcast is Rhonda Noordyk. Rhonda is a well-known certified divorce financial analyst and host of the must-listen-to podcast, Disrupting Divorce, Conversations for Women. She's internationally known for her work in pioneering a path for women in the divorce space. Rhonda, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on, and I want to start by asking you, what led you to specialize in financial coaching for women thinking about divorce or going through the divorce process?
How much time do we have? There's a lot of layers to that question, right? And I think first of all, I spent 12 years in the financial industry educating and empowering women, and a lot of them, at that time, my specialty really wasn't working with women that were going through divorce, but I had a lot of women that were coming into my office. Hey, Rhonda, I'm contemplating or I'm going through divorce. I don't know what to ask. I'm feeling overwhelmed about the finances. I don't know if I'm even getting a good deal, right? And so that was part of it. The other part of it is, I think, a lot of times people will say, where does this passion for advocating for people stem from? And a lot of that stuff goes back to our childhood, right? You're like, oh, yeah. And I'm actually working on a journal that's going to be launching in September that's going to walk people through a process around their confidence related to money. Because for me, a lot of the work that I'm doing, the ability for me to connect with women, I understand more than maybe they know that I do. Like my dad was a addicted to gambling. He was an alcoholic. My parents almost got divorced. Like there was a lot of my money story that I'm able to leverage in a good way.
And let me ask you about that, because it's fascinating, listening to your answer. When you think back to one's childhood, how do those early years, the memories of how people think about money, how money is discussed at the kitchen table, how people grow up, how does that impact someone down the road, much later in life, whether they're married or if they're contemplating or thinking about divorce?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And one of the very first people that I read or learned about that kind of addressed this topic head on was a woman named Karen Kingsbury. And she basically, at the end of the day, what she was looking at was a money story, a map. And you think of it like a family tree, right? Where you map out, but it's really more for the sake of identifying the attitudes and beliefs about money than the actual lineage, right? And so I would take my clients through that exercise. But of course, before I do that, I always say, okay, guess who gets to do it first? And I looked at my grandparents and their attitudes about money. I looked at my parents. I looked at what did I bring to my relationship with money as a result of that. And sometimes it's there and we can't really put our finger on why. Like,
Sure.
Why is it that some people have an aversion to debt? Why is it that some people are willing to take risks? Why is it that some people are savers or spenders? And a lot of that comes back to, well, what was modeled, right? What were those attitudes and beliefs? And then we bring it into a relationship that maybe one party's handling the finances and you're like, oh, good, I don't have to handle it because, man, there's anxiety around that for me. Fast forward, right? And this is where you and I see a lot of it. It's like, oh, we have to still deal with that stuff and unpack it. And it brings a lot of those feelings and thoughts to the surface that maybe have laid dormant for sometimes even decades.
Rhonda, one of your missions is to disrupt divorce. What does that mean?
Well, I chuckle because you and I have had this conversation.
We
We're like,
have.
yes, let's bring it on. So here's the thing. So the word disruption to me really means challenging the status quo, looking for ways to do things better. It doesn't mean, hey, I want to walk into a room and tick people off, right? It's not my brand. It's not my personality. But I also am going to stand firm and not get pushed around, right? And that's really, I think, what my clients are looking for. Like, Rhonda, I want to be able to show up to these conversations and be able to ask good questions. I want to be able to have an idea of what's being proposed and be able to critically think through, is it a good option or not? Or are there other solutions that maybe we haven't thought of? So disrupting divorce is, it doesn't mean do mediation. It doesn't mean like there isn't going to be conflict, any of that, right? I think a lot of times people are afraid to disrupt things. And I have found that I think that the divorce industry needs to be disrupted.
No, I'm right there with you. I know we've had this conversation offline, and obviously you from the financial perspective, me thinking about it from the as the divorce attorney, thinking about your career. You've done some remarkable things. You talk about your background and the financial space, and now working with women, thinking about divorce, going through divorce. If you had to think about a pivotal moment in your life that has influenced your career, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a vulnerable question. I like it. So it kind of brings me back to, so there's a couple things in my growth, right? As was in the financial industry, I remember sitting in my office one day saying, okay, what's the next step? What does the next 5 years look like for my business? And that's always a scary question to ask, right? Because we're like, do I really want to know what the answer is? And so, long story short, I had the opportunity to go through an incubator for small business owners. This was back in 2014. And when I mapped out the vision, the gentleman who was coaching me said, Rhonda, I think that what you want to do is going to require you, and we put that in air quotes, right? Require you
Sure.
to go a different direction and perhaps leave the financial industry. And I was like, oh, we're not hearing that. Like, I've worked too hard for these licenses and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I went through that program and I could see it. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, I had the opportunity to be able to evaluate the direction that I wanted to go and leave the financial industry. And that was a really challenging time for me. I remember thinking I never looked back, but at the same time, I really always wanted to put myself in a position where I had the opportunity to do hard things. So, like, for example, leasing an office. Eventually, I ended up buying an office space, got equity investors. I'd never done any of that stuff before. Like, I bought a car on my own. I mean, I would just like throw myself into these situations because I'm like, okay, I want to see what it's like if I was showing up to make this decision independently, knowing that I don't have to, but I'm choosing to, and just flexing that muscle. Kind of along those lines, speaking of buying an office, that was an interesting dynamic because I had done the research. I had an idea that it would be a good investment, but I didn't want to like hear the noise of anybody else. So I like met with the broker, I met with the people, I met with the banker. I didn't tell anybody else I was going. I just went. I was like, I always say, I'm like, okay, put on some extra deodorant because you're like, I'm like was super nervous, but you're like,
Yeah.
okay. And I'm not a very good poker face. You're like, okay. And I just said, hey, listen, I'm happy to make a swift decision when I have all of the information. And what ended up happening was we did that real estate transaction without a real estate agent, not recommending that, but it just worked out that way. And the gentleman that was selling the space was a real estate agent. He had been doing it for 30 years. But the pivotal moment there, Evan, was I had put in an offer on buying this space, got an SBA loan to be able to do it, which was super cool. And the gentleman, the real estate agent, calls me from the airport. He's like, Rhonda, I just got your deal and I'm offended. I'm like, offended for what? I'm like, you know how this works? If you don't like my offer, then counter in writing. Like, and that was the moment when I stood up for myself. And he did. He countered back. We closed the deal. And sitting at that table, right, closing on that space, I had the CPA and the attorney and the title. I mean, everyone was like, Rhonda, this was a great deal. Which all of those people were men, right? They're like, hey, good deal. It was like fist bumps, right? Like, hey, good. But the thing that was so powerful for that was I had never done that. I knew nothing. But what I said was, hey, I'm happy to make a swift decision when I have all of the information. And, right, I asked really good questions. Tell me exactly why we have to do that. Help me understand, fill in the blank. And people were super happy to share their wisdom and their knowledge with me. And the divorce process, I think, is somewhat similar in a sense of we're not going to know, right, all the things as the person who's going through divorce. They're not going to know all the questions to be asking. They're not going to, you just got to surround yourself with really good people and ask. You don't even have to ask necessarily the best question. You just have to say, help me understand that. Why do you suggest it, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
no, absolutely. You were spot on. And Rhonda, we all wear multiple hats. I wear multiple hats. You wear multiple hats. We often play the role of therapist. What percent of your work in the role of working with women going through a divorce is it being compassionate, empathetic, versus being strategic and assertive?
ooh, this is you ask really great questions. I love this. So I would say it's probably I don't know, 80-20. Now the question is what's 80 and what's 20, right? I think that there's a healthy amount of compassion and care, right? I think that's 20%. I think the other 80% for me is what's the next best thing we can be doing? And I think if people get good at asking that question, we can start to dial in and move the needle. And you and I have talked and we've worked with clients mutually, and we're really doing a good job of kind of working together as a team for those litigated cases to be able to help them navigate through that. But I think at the end of the day, the key thing is to be able to help our clients start to think strategically as well. And yet we can't say, hey, leave the emotion at the door. I mean,
Sure.
especially for women, right? I mean, we're not going to compartmentalize that. There's a lot of emotion that goes into that. But I would say it's 80% strategic and 20% caring and compassion.
What are some misconceptions that women have about their financial stability during a divorce?
So the story that comes to my mind is this was earlier on in my business, but there was a woman I was working with, and she was working full time and had a decent handle on the finances. And I remember saying to her, hey, do you know what your credit score is? And she said, no, but it's terrible. And I said, well, what's terrible? She's like, I don't know. I think it's like 470. I'm like, 470? And and so she's like, well, okay, I'll go on and look. Well, let's just say it wasn't 470, right? It was like 630. Well, that's a far cry from 470. But here's the thing. She was carrying around and walking as if she had a 470 credit score. And that heaviness, I think, was impacting her decisions and all of those things that kind of go along with that, right? So, I mean, for me, that really stands out as being one of those things where it's like, ultimately, that's a misperception. Like, am I going to be okay? Is it going to be fair? All of those things we can unpack as well. But I think at the end of the day, it's just get the information. Oh, well, I can't do Cobra, for example. Well, do we know what it is? No, but it's going to be more expensive. Well, how about we just get the data and get the info, and then we can evaluate what's going to be the best decision. I think a lot of times there's a lot of fear, I think, that clouds women's ability to be able to think through the numbers. And I always try to say, okay, how can we simplify this in a way that helps women understand these concepts? Because you and I have talked so many times about it's not black and white. I mean,
Nope.
we have to be able to look at, okay, what's important to you and how do we back into or dial into what exactly it is that you need coming out of this, and how can we help advocate for you? Meanwhile, right, it's not coming from a position of wanting to take the guys out at the knees, but there is kind of this natural imbalance of power for the person, the moneyed spouse, all of those kinds of things. Knowledge, experience, I think plays into that. And one of the formulas that I will often share with people is if we want to get to confidence, there's a simple formula for it. And it was actually based out of a Prudential study. So Prudential did a longitudinal study. They did a study in 2000 and a study in 2010, and I haven't seen that they did one in 2020, probably because their findings were pretty much the same. They're like, we're not spending another penny yet. But what they were looking at was attitudes and beliefs about money for women. And the key takeaway was it's knowledge plus experience that builds the confidence. And so I always say, if we have the knowledge without the experience, it's theory. If we have the experience without the knowledge, it's trial and error. But man, when we get those two working together, we can not only help with the confidence, we can accelerate that, right? And it's step by step by step, right? Each piece of the divorce process around money is an opportunity for us to gain some knowledge and some experience that will help facilitate that confidence piece. So I think there's, that confidence is really an important part. Like, hey, I haven't handled the finances. Yes, and now's a great time, right? Oh, my husband's super smart. He probably is, and.
Yeah. So let me ask you about that, because you use the word fear. We're talking about a lot of different emotions that your clients go through or have when they're going through a divorce. How do you handle situations when a client's emotions are telling her to take positions and ask for certain things that might be adverse to sound financial advice?
Yeah. Do you have a specific example in mind?
It's a great question. Let's use the example of I want the marital residence or I want the vacation home because of let's say the social circles, right? And again, that's a real concern, that's a real ask, but the thought process is, because when you go through a divorce, it's the loss, right? It's the loss of your loved one. It's a loss of finances. It's a loss of social circles. So in that instance, right, people will want to hold on to certain assets for certain reasons. In that case, it's the social aspect and perhaps the image, but financially, it may not make sense.
So that's always a tricky one, right? Because at the end of the day, the goal is to be able to empower them to make good decisions,
Sure.
right? And as much as you and I want to advocate, at the end of the day, the clients really have to decide. But the approach that I have taken that has seemed to help is I usually don't say right out of the gate, you can't afford it. what I'll say is, hey, listen, I don't know if you can afford it or not, but let's dive into the numbers. Let's look at some different scenarios. Let's look at some options. And sometimes the numbers speak for themselves. Sometimes they'll say, okay, yeah, you're right. I can't really, hey, based on what we're seeing, yeah, I'm thinking it's not a good idea for me to keep it. Sometimes I don't even have to tell them that, right? There are other situations where I really do have to probably tell them more firmly, like, I don't think this is a good idea. And then I'll go back and say, okay, was there another time that went sideways that I can tap into and share a story, right? And one of the stories that comes to mind for me is there was actually a woman who reached out. She didn't actually hire me, but was following me on Instagram. And I happened to share a story of another person that another scenario I was working with. And she sent me a private message and she goes, Rhonda, that's me. And what happened was she had given her husband, his pension in its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
She kept the equity of the home, kept the home. She was working as a nurse full time. And what happened was she lost her job. She couldn't pay for the house. She foreclosed on it. And so now she has no house, no job, and no retirement. And I was like, oh my gosh. So that's a story that I'll tell people, like, listen, let me help you. I think the other part of it is it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to, there's so many creative solutions with lending and options that we can explore all the options. 99% of the time, we can find a way to make it work without giving everything up in exchange for giving up your future in exchange for the house. But those are just a couple things that I have done that it has seemed to work. And then you always have those few people that no matter what we tell them, they're going to do it. And I say, listen, here are the pros and cons of it, and you've got to make your decision. Then what comes to mind there. So there was a client, and this is exactly it, she was so bent on keeping the house that she was like, okay, well, can I take out a loan out of my 401k? Can I take out a home equity line? Can I refinance and do a cash out? And she goes through this laundry list. And I'm like, none of these are a good idea. Like, none of them make sense for your situation because they had $100,000 worth of marital debt and their house was worth twice that, right? It was a Midwest property. And so it was worth maybe $250,000. Well, she had a real estate agent that we work with come in and offer to buy it for cash. And she turned it down. And so I'm like, you have all this debt. Every number that I run, any way that we look at, you're not going to be able to overcome the debt obligation of $50,000, you're half of it. In addition to the house, and then giving up your taking money out for penalties, all of that. It's just like, oh my gosh. So finally I was like, listen, it doesn't sound like like you're going to listen to me. So you just need to do what you're going to do and then deal with the consequences of it. Because I don't know what else to tell you.
Yes, there's some people who you're just not going to get through. Rhonda, I want to ask you, what changes would you like to see in the financial and divorce industries to help better support women?
I want there to actually be some consideration for income and expenses. So like, for example, we talk about, some people will say, oh, it's a lifestyle thing, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, what does that mean? Because if we do an entire analysis on lifestyle and it's not going to count on the court side anyways, what is the point, right? So I was working on another case and the state that I was working in, they said, well, there can't be unconscionable differences between income and expenses. And I was like, well, who decides what unconscionable is? Like, what I think is unconscionable on behalf of my client is going to be different than what he thinks is unconscionable. And like, how do we even define that? Right. So I just feel like there's inconsistency. Everything's black and white. We have to be able to dial in the numbers. And at the end of the day, I think I would like to be able to see, the income and expense thing, I think, is the biggest thing. Property division, I wouldn't say it's straightforward, but it's a little bit more straightforward. But the support calculations, what numbers are we putting in for support? The outputs we get are only going to be as good as the numbers we put into the calculator. And if we're not including, what are we using for their income, right? Are we using salary plus bonuses? But there's no consistency.
And the other thing too, and I would add, a lot of the complaints that you hear from people when you have conversations with people around the country and when the divorce space, the lack of consistency, not only in the system, but when you go from one judge to another judge, right? In how judges feel about spousal support and alimony or how certain assets are going to be divided, there's not that consistency. And I know that gives people going through a divorce a huge concern.
Yeah, it really is. And you know, it's interesting because I think there are certainly some attorneys who have an attitude of like, well, it is what it is. And I just had this conversation yesterday with a potential client. I said, here's the problem. If it is what it is, or was what it was, or whatever, then it wouldn't matter who the judge was because they'd all be ruling the same.
True.
Right? I'm like,
True.
the logic, there is not like my logical brain is like, wait, that doesn't even make sense.
Let's talk about the Women's Financial Wellness Center. Tell us about the community that you've created and how you think the members benefit from being part of this community, and do they find support in one
Yeah.
another?
Yeah. No, thanks for asking. So we developed what we call our bridge community, and it is really designed to help people go from crisis to closure in about 6 months or less, right? It's a very step-by-step kind of process. And yes, there's support, but I would say it's support from a very practical, action-orientated position, right? Like, okay, well, again, what's the next best thing that you can be doing? So the bridge method is really kind of the basis for that community. So the B is breathe and build your team. Are you doing litigation, mediation, collaborative, pro se? And who are those people that you need on your essential team? And then we have review the financials. It's gathering and organizing the documents. And again, I know that there's times when the attorney's offices will do that, but I want to give my clients the ability to start touch the paper or download the like just and have a really clear process on how to do that because I have the opportunity to help build their confidence. We're looking at budgeting, we're identifying gaps in information, so that's gaps in transparency, gaps in information, dialing in the data and demystifying what the data is related to property division and support, and then guide to finish strong and exhale is kind of like the key thing. But the community has been interesting because there is this organic support from the other members that are part of that community, but most of them I'm kind of that central piece where they're looking to me for input or guidance. It's been very successful, and part of that was I taught in higher education for over 10 years. And so I knew how to build curriculum in a way that even though I have 100 people going through my community at a time, I know how to dial in, right? Provide a baseline of education and then dial in the specifics that are going to help move the needle. And it's been successful. We just recently got a Google review from a woman who went through our Bridge program and was part of the Bridge community. And that really structured and yet accessible support, right? They can ask questions anytime. It's not like available all the time, but it's structured and same day responses on questions, which I think helps women say, okay, I got the answer to that. Now I can move on to the next thing instead of, I don't even know, what to be asking, or I don't want to call my attorney. Or again, if it's financial related questions and I can even give them the questions to go back and ask the attorney, we're really streamlining that process. But anyways, the Google ad or the Google review that I got was she went through the Bridge program, walked away with $330,000 better settlement because of some of the stuff that we were able to teach her in the program. And it's cool. I mean,
That's
it's
awesome.
like,
No, that's awesome. And look, it's a credit to you and your focus on education and your focus on, I mean, look, you love what you do, you're great at what you do, you work with people going through a difficult time, but it's a credit to you. And I have to ask, look, the wellness center, it's successful, right? So as you fast forward and think ahead and you take out that crystal ball of yours, what does it look like in 10 years from now?
yeah, I really want to do more speaking. I have done a lot of speaking over the years, and then of course COVID happened and all that jazz. I want to do more speaking. I want to really be traveling and doing education, whether it's to other professionals. A lot of people have reached out to say, hey, how can we do what you're doing? So whether it's franchising the model or I don't know. I mean, I think the key thing will remain the same, and that is empowering women, right? Now, 10 years from now, we fast forward, you're like, it's a long time. Am I going to be burned out? And I have always said, if I get to the point where I am not bringing the fire and the passion and the advocacy, then it's time for me to move on and doing something else. And I don't know when that will be, right? But as of right now, it's continuing to be a thought leader, a women's advocacy thought leader throughout the country, and just really continuing to build a place, virtually or otherwise, that women can come and they know that somebody's going to listen to them. Somebody understands what they're going through. Somebody's vetted other professionals like you, right? That I'm like, we just are launching our locations tab on our website to show all of the different locations that we work in. And New York's up next month. I'm so excited. So we're going to be like starting to really promote like, hey, we're working in New York. And it's been fun. I mean, I think at the end of the day, Evan, for me, it's I just want to make an impact. I have said from the very, and I get like emotional about this, but like I said from the first day that I started my business, if I can help one woman improve her relationship with money, I have empowered her for a lifetime. I have a small window in which I can help build their confidence, help them understand some of the financial basics, and then move on. And I have clients that reach out many years later, right? I mean, I've been doing this long enough now that some of them are getting remarried. And I was like, okay. So, and actually one woman reached out, she's like, Rhonda, I think I need to do a prenup. And I was like, girl, yes, you do. Because we
Yes, you
worked too
do.
hard
Yep.
too. But it was funny because that was 6 years ago that I worked
Wow.
with her. And she messages me like, hey, and I said, I'm so glad you said that because you know me well enough to know that if you didn't tell me that's why you're reaching out and you were just telling me you were getting married, that was going to be my subset question, which was, are you planning on getting a prenuptial agreement? Her husband owned a business and it was one of my very first success stories. And we moved the needle multiple seven figures. And I was like, holy smokes, the impact that I can have. And for me, it's not always just about the dollar amount. It's more about the percentage. But I remember in that moment thinking, oh, wow, there's a lot of impact here that I can have for
Tremendous
people,
impact, and it's awesome.
right?
And you're making a difference. And even to hear like your example and your story, someone you worked with comes back to you 5 years, 6 years later. She's looking to get remarried, and yeah, I mean that's got to mean the world to you, knowing that you are making an impact. You are making a difference in people's lives going through, I mean, a scary time. I mean, you mentioned the word fear before. I mean, people going through divorce, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear about the process, what's going to happen with the things that matter most in their lives, their kids, their money. It is a very scary time for someone going through the process. And you do such a wonderful job making that process.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to ask the clients you work with, they learn so much from you. And we've talked about your process. We've talked about the way you get involved with clients, thinking about divorce, going through a divorce. What do you learn from the women you work with?
What's interesting, because I think the thing that I learned the most is how much I appreciate them being vulnerable. Because I've been in those spots over the years where you have to be vulnerable, right? And
Sure.
it's not easy. So I think there's a couple things. One is just, I guess what they provide for me is encouragement, like encouragement that I'm doing the right thing, encouragement that I'm making a difference. What I'm learning on the tactical side of like the day-to-day stuff is there's always so much to be learning in this space. And this is all I do. Like, I'm not dabbling in it. You're like, oh my gosh, there's just so much. So I always feel like I'm always learning something about the financial aspect, whether it's there's a change in the pensions, there's some potential changes with Social Security, and like that's on the table. Don't know really where that's going. There's so many of these things where you're like, okay, or even the most recent one, right? Where I guess it's keeping me on my toes, I guess you could say, is just as far as the desire to continue to learn and think critically on how that's going to impact my clients. Like the National Association of Realtors just made that change where now they're going to be asking the buyers to pay the commission on the buyer's agents. And I was like, now how, and they were going to make that change in July of 2024. Now they bumped it back to August of 2024. But I'm like, okay, well, how does that impact my clients though? If I have a client who's going to be buying, they're going to have to come to the table with money to pay the buyer, their agent. They're going to try to DIY it, which I don't think is a good idea, or they're going to have the seller as part of their incentive, right, to agree to pay the buyer's commission. And so, I mean, I get where they're coming from as part of like the spirit of transparency, but it's like it takes me like first of all I have to like get enough to learn about it and I wouldn't say that I'm obviously the expert on real estate, but I want to understand it enough to say, okay, how does this impact? What does this mean for? One of the things we learned at our last CDFA conference is that there's some stuff on the table with Social Security, and if they make some of those changes, so basically what they were proposing is that after the divorce, right, that Social Security would reduce the spousal benefit by 1% a year up to 33%. That
Wow.
no, nothing's been signed. But again, you're like, okay, if that, then what? And trying to stay ahead of that stuff. It's just kind of crazy. But I have learned to be very patient. I've learned to yeah, I mean, I think there's always stuff that I can be learning, right? And yeah, tactical and otherwise.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful thing. And Rhonda, I want to bring on back on the set the guy who keeps me on my toes, producer Dave. Producer Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you for a fun segment that we do on the podcast called They Said It.
They said it.
They said it.
They said it.
Yes. Welcome back to They Said It, where we have 3 quotes from famous people on the subject of, I'm not even going to tell you what the subject is, but let's just say Rhonda. Rhonda, I think, will know a thing or two about these, and she'll tell us whether these so-called wizards and philosophers are correct, incorrect, or maybe somewhere in between. First one comes to us from Warren Buffett, who I think knows a thing or two about money. He said the following: do not save what is left after spending, but spend what is left after saving. I had to read this 3 times before I figured it out. But, Rhonda, you're a smarter person than I, so what do you think about this quote?
I like it. I think that it's a great thing for people to be striving for. I think I would encourage people to not put too much pressure on themselves right after the divorce because they're just trying to get stuff settled, but I say thumbs up.
Our next quote comes to us from actress Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who said the following: you don't have to play masculine to be a strong woman. Your thoughts on that one?
Ooh. So I think I do think that there is a time when we have to, as women, actually tap into what would be considered more masculine energy. I don't think we have to be masculine, but I think we need to tap into the masculine energy sometimes, which is sometimes being direct, sometimes being a little bit more assertive, being confident. So tapping into some of those things that, you know, like when I went back and did that real estate transaction, I had to tap into masculine energy, but I was not showing up masculine. So there's a balance to that, right? Like you can still maintain that feminine side, but just, I don't know, on the disc profile, it's more like being direct.
Do we still see old-fashioned men who are getting divorced who think that they are just going to come in and get everything that they want just because of their gender?
Oh, yeah.
I realize you're outnumbered by gender on the podcast, Rhonda. However, I have to think that that's still a thing, unfortunately, right? But you're part of the army to combat that attack.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it is true. I mean, I see it a lot primarily because, again, the women that I'm working with are the ones who want that advocacy, right? For a variety of different reasons. And so from my experience, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of shenanigans that's happening, I think. And one of the things that I see a lot of times them doing is tapping into what I call the DAM method, which is dodging the disclosure, avoiding getting assets valued, misrepresenting information, feeling like they're above the law, can do whatever. And sometimes they get away with it, right? If they don't have the right people that are holding them accountable.
Right. But women, no need to actually go in wearing cowboy hat and cowboy boots or an army helmet or something. No. Okay.
Well, and you know what? It's interesting, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
So when I was in the financial industry, this is interesting. So when I was in the financial industry, one of the things that one of my colleagues said was, hey, Rhonda, you should be wearing a 3-piece pinstripe black suit. And I was like, no, not happening. Right? I mean, I had blue nails. I mean, it was just like, no, I'm not doing that, right? So there was some pushback of that even when I was in the financial industry. And I remember there was a woman I was working with who was going into a meeting primarily with men and felt like she had to dress down, like in a sense of like, we're all black. And like, I'm like, like, you don't have to do that, right? I mean, you can show up. And I think that, and really at the end of the day, I believe that the clients are in a good space if they have good male and female energy working together on their behalf because they complement each other, right? So yeah, so no need to feel like they have to be dull and blend in.
Right. Final quote for They Said It comes to us from Japanese writer Haruki Murakami, and he said the following: when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what the storm is all about. Ooh. Your thoughts on that one?
This one evokes a lot of emotion for me because I really believe that my clients, as they're walking through this process, have an opportunity to come out better, more empowered, have a better understanding about money, have wins and successes and challenges, right? That they haven't had maybe in quite some time. So I love that quote. I think it's spot on.
There's something to wisdom. Wisdom is part knowledge, part experience, but I think it's also part battle scars, right? People that have been through a few things, they're kind of more textured, interesting people to me. That's why when I hear people in their 20s complaining about their life, I say, just wait. Just wait till a real challenge rears its ugly head, right? No offense to the millennials and Gen Zers who might be listening to the Shine On podcast. Anyway, Rhonda, you did terrific on They Said It. Our studio audience is standing and giving you a standing ovation. And back to you, Evan, to wrap things up.
Dave, that was awesome. Rhonda, this was an absolute blast. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast, your podcast, which you have, which is absolutely brilliant, a must-listen to podcast, Disrupting Divorce. Tell everyone, tell all the listeners where they could listen to your podcast, get in touch with you, be part of your wonderful community, and find all the wonderful resources and everything you have going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the one-stop shop is probably going to be my website, wfwcdivorce.com. They can listen to the podcast, they can read the blog articles, they can reach out and grab a time to chat, they can grab a free resource. Yeah, lots of stuff going on the website.
And I'll say,
so that's
having been to your website, I mean, there is just so much wonderful information. I mean, your website, between the blogs and between the podcast, it truly is just a wonderful place to learn so much, to educate yourself, to anyone who's thinking about divorce, going through the divorce process. There's so much terrific information. I encourage everybody who's listening to reach out and, see what Rhonda's up to and all the wonderful resources she has on her website. And Rhonda, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Season 4, episode 78. Dave, what an absolutely great episode. Rhonda Noordyk, financial strategist and host of the Must Listen To podcast, Disrupting Divorce, Conversations for Women. Dave, Rhonda was awesome. You're awesome. Happy July 4th. How great was today's episode?
Terrific episode. Good way to go into the July 4th holidays. I hope there are lots of fireworks, and I hope my Red Sox provide some fireworks against the Yankees soon this summer. Evan, we're coming for you. We're coming for you.
You can only dream, Dave. You can only dream. Thank you to all the listeners. And Dave, thank you as always. You can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple, the Boston Podcast Network. I'm Evan Shine, and I'll talk to you again.